to the 1960s. Oh, thank you, Lisa. I forgot that. We know climate change has been a pressing issue since the 1960s. It has roots from before that in terms of all sorts of societal developments. But from the 1960s on, you have people like Richard Nixon, of all people, founding the EPA because of pressure about pesticides. There are rivers on fire because of steel mills, et cetera. There's an overwhelming consensus that this is what's happening. But a recent study from the Lear Center points out that in scripted television, less than 2.8% of our work contains climate related words, and only 1% of the shows that they surveyed had any mention of climate at all. So we exist in this space where, given that this is our reality, like we're living with climate change, we don't really tell stories about it in the same way that we tell stories about pretty much everything else. One of the report from the Lear Center is actually called a glaring absence because it's speaking to the power of storytelling to change public opinion. And one of the places I wanted to start with you before I sort of dive into my notes is if you feel up to it in the chat, I'd love to because I can't see all of you. I would love to have you post up your names, post up your pronouns, and if there are like things that make you feel like afraid about writing of climate or make you feel like you can't write about climate, what are those things? Pop them up into the chat. We have discussion breakout rooms for later in the evening. So if there are things that you feel really challenged to talk about or things that you really want to talk about, please feel free to just say, hey, I can see Adria here. So Adria, I'm sorry, I'm going to pick on you. I'm Adria, and I really, really want to talk about biodiversity loss, or I really want to talk about how it is you build climate characters that don't feel like binary oppositions. So I'd love it if we could do that. Oh, thank you, Adria. Oh, you've written a feature and you're trying to get it financed. Excellent. Yeah. How to make stories fun. Absolutely. Yeah, and that sense of like if we've talked about climate once, that we're done at that point. Lyria is coming across as earnest. Yep, absolutely. Working in the kids space. And there may be unique challenges in the kids space. Like I feel like at least the earnestness perhaps has some space there because we don't want to say absolutely not, but I think it's an interesting balance to try to strike. All right. Well, I am cognizant of our time, but definitely keep going. I would love to see what else is coming up. And both Lisa and Elsa are keeping an eye on the chat. Oh, how to show characters' lives are changed. Yep. Environmental stories is documentary and start looking at fiction. Wonderful. All right. Keep that coming. Yeah. Code around comedy as well. All right. So, what I tend to find when I speak to people about climate writing is our challenges, especially in the fictional space, tend to fall into a few categories. And I'm seeing some of them popping up in the chat already. That often there's a fear of appearing biased, right? This idea that like we're being too earnest, we're creating propaganda when we're in the midst of climate writing. That will come up for a lot of writers. Sometimes people will feel, as I don't know if this is exactly the thing that the person who's looking at moving from documentary to the scripted space, there's a fear of being like intimidated by the science or the like, how are you going to disseminate the complexity of the science? That can be something that feels like a challenge for us. There can definitely be, as we're seeing, fears that climate doesn't fit right into a genre, that it's too serious or too frightening to find spaces in things that are funny or romantic or uplifting. And sometimes, and I think this speaks to the earnestness again, this fear that sometimes positive responses will feel like simplistic or utopian or open us up to ridicule because of their sort of their earnestness. And so all of these are things I think we experience as we move into the space of trying to write about climate. And so I'd love to I'm going to take a little while to talk about why it is we're feeling these things, like where some of these things may be coming from, and what some of the levers are that we can start to use to think about moving our brains around them. So this first one, this idea of there being a perception of bias, uh, it's an interesting problem because I'm sure all of you have felt from time to time that as you're trying to represent the world, there's like a resistance. It's almost like talking about climate change in our scripted work is like touching a third rail, right? We're not supposed to do it. And the reality of this is that for as long as some of you, I'm sure, have been alive, the way we've talked about climate change in public discourse has been really, really polarized, right? We have a kind of false binary that's been created by this idea that both sides have to be given equal weight, even though scientific consensus is on one side of the matter, and that by bringing these things up, we're perhaps shaming people, which people don't like to do. And so it makes us tentative to move into the space. And what that's resulted in then is because we don't write about climate change, we live in that false binary, and the feeling that forwarding one side might be political propaganda kind of grows for us. But it's worth thinking about the idea that we're all here right now, and Elsa's got these stats that like 76% of people want to hear about climate change because it is part of the reality of our life. And so one of the things that I'll do to sort of try to lever myself back across this worry about like, oh, what if this looks like propaganda? What if this seems biased? Is to ask myself, well, what am I doing if I'm creating worlds where climate change doesn't exist? Like in some ways, if we are writing worlds where climate change doesn't exist, we are performing a kind of propaganda. We're just performing a kind of propaganda for people for whom the existence of climate change and its fallout is inconvenient. So I can find it can be really useful to think about rather than forcing an agenda, asking myself, am I representing the world accurately? Right? That becomes rather than thinking it has to be attached to this particular political agenda or that particular political agenda, am I just being honest about what's happening in the world right now? The next one of these challenges that tends to come up is very much this idea of how do we address the complexity of climate change? Because climate change is enormous, right? It's enormous in terms of time. It has its roots in the Industrial Revolution and in agriculture. It moves through colonialism. It moves through industrial capitalism. It moves through all sorts of things in terms of like time scales for the planet, the scope of global commerce. There's enormous complexity in it. It's an intersectional problem. And that can feel really overwhelming when we think we're trying to write about it. And we can also feel, because again, one of our jobs as writers is often to sort of try to make sense of things, to try to narrativize them in ways that are digestible, that there's therefore an obligation to somehow encompass this idea completely and to be perfectly scientifically accurate. And especially in the scripted space, that first one is one that I'll think about as to what extent must I be perfectly scientifically accurate? If you're writing a police procedural, and I don't know if there's anyone in here who does, but there are moments where you don't, lie about the truth of what police are doing, but you probably fudge the exact, like, no one's reading out the whole Miranda rights on the screen. And so thinking about getting the heart of what's happening with climate right can be enormously powerful. Thinking about our art as something that is really personal, that's about the individual. Because again, a lot of our narratives, the way we write narrative tends to be very individualistic as opposed to large and global. So thinking about what's your smaller piece, what's a narrative that we can tell for one person about climate, tends to leverage what we're really good at in terms of narrative, rather than forcing us to like be responsible for the entirety of the climate crisis. We're not. You can find whether you want to talk about like what biodiversity might mean to someone, or whether you want to talk about what the local community garden might mean to someone. Those small personal spaces can be specific, personal, and revelatory in terms of how we approach scripted work. And finally, I'm going to speak about both climate not fitting in genres and a little bit to the utopian instinct here. One of the reasons it can be really uncomfortable to find space for climate in genres where we feel like it doesn't fit is that genres themselves are built upon prior expectations, right? Like what we understand a genre collectively to be happens because of what we have thought of as belonging to the bracket of the genre and what we've seen before. So because we don't have a lot of examples of what climate looks like in a rom-com or what climate looks like in a flat out comedy or in an action movie. We have more action movie examples like 2012 and things like that. Um, we sometimes feel like, oh, I don't know where this goes because it doesn't feel like the genre expectations work around it. And we also may struggle with the idea that this does feel, I'm sure for you as well as for me, like this is a very large problem. It's huge, and the sort of the suffering around it is real. So how does that fit in these genres that don't seem to want to talk about those sorts of things? And so this is a space where one of the tools I find that's really useful is thinking about, rather than thinking about forcing climate into something where it's not going to be organically, it's absolutely worth looking at where are the climate borders of something. Like in rom-coms, for example, we can all think of like the rom-com cliche of people running to meet each other in the rain. And right there, you have a border where the landscape or where the weather is happening inside the text. And so, are there ways in which you can, in the very fine dramatic tradition of making the world, the pathetic fallacy, right? Making the world reflect what's going on with the characters, can you leverage in climate in that way? Are there spaces where climate makes sense to emerge from one particular character? You can think about how much work Reservation Dogs gets from Dallas Goldtooth, right? In terms of that character and all the things that character intends to put forward, just brings the climate into the border of this work that has other things it wants to talk about, but is acknowledging that space. Uh, I'm loving the chat too. Please continue. If you have like projects and other pieces and references, get them into the chat. One of the nice things about a masterclass is many of the people here are experts too. And I think it's always really useful to think that the climate crisis itself is not monolithic. We Because we've been so used to it being discussed in this really polarized space, in this space where there are activists who are very earnest and there are polluters who are evil and wrong. That sort of simplistic discourse, uh, it masks all the things that might be underneath it. People respond to climate in fascinating ways, right? There are people who you wouldn't think of as being engaged in climate mitigation in the American Midwest who are like they're hammering up solar panels right now. There are interesting diagonals. And so thinking about what are your personal responses and experiences? Like who are your like, especially for comedy, who are your not your big monolithic climate villains, but who are your petty climate villains, right? We all know what it is to be irritated with that one person at work who just won't sort their garbage, and we can feel the humanness of those things. So looking at ways in that way can be enormously helpful for us. To that end, one of the first things I'd love for us to do is just to take some time to work on what are your thoughts and feelings about climate change and where do you feel it touching your life. So I'm going to pull up, so I think I'm going to unshare this for a second and create us a little whiteboard in the Zoom meeting. And please feel free. I'm hoping you can all see the whiteboard as it exists. Get in there, grab yourself a pen or a text box. And I'd love for you to be thinking about what is your personal experience of the climate crisis? How does it touch your life? How does it touch your body? How are you feeling about it right now? Let's create a map of the territory where we are. Ah, thanks, Elsa. I will get those questions into the chat. Oh, yeah. Worry about what's going to be there for kids. That's a big one. So, oh, sorry if I'm moving someone else's thing there. I'm trying to get this text box. No, all right, I'm leaving that. Oh, having to evacuate from the California wildfire. And again, it's thinking about things like, where does that live in your body? I always think also that I want stories of hope that feel realistic. Oh, yeah. So like a real feeling of impatience coming up. Absolutely. Yeah. Stories about community and resilience. And again, oh, yeah, the idea of things living like pieces, the things that live in our chest, right? That sort of feeling. Oh, yeah. People who lost their homes in the wildfires. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it'll move that up. Yeah, we want to see more stories that center on BIPOC communities. Yes, that's a big piece to always think about when you're coming into climate writing, is that a lot of the effects tend to be intersectional, that like things like sacrifice zones are something you never want to ignore when you're thinking about how you're shaping a climate reality. Yeah, the anxiety itself, that just people feeling anxious. Oh, that's great. Oh yeah. Stories that, yeah, that reflect how many people are worried about this. Yeah, that it can feel painful when you're watching things and you don't actually feel like people are talking about the things that you find yourself talking about with your friends. Yeah. Yeah, stories that celebrate people who are making a difference. I think about that a lot too, because in preparing this, like you think about things like the fact that rivers in the US used to set themselves on fire all the time because of the runoff from steel plants. And we used to have a huge problem with the ozone layer. And we have successfully mobilized before. So these sort of stories that make it feel like defeat is inevitable and capitalism and the things extraction is monolithic. And yeah, sometimes finding that space to celebrate small efforts is amazing. All right. Oh, this is one of the things that always kills me about how short these are. I would love to see more of this all the time, but we're gonna have to move back on to the next set, but we're gonna keep this great whiteboard. Uh, I'm going to close up the whiteboard, but we're going to keep it and we're going to come back to it for our next exercise. All right. Okay, there we are. So, in this section, I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the thinking within environmental circles and in environmental sort of literary criticism that can be useful tools for approaching these problems and for shifting our storytelling mindset. So within this, we're going to talk a little bit about disaster capitalism and narrative aporia. We're going to talk a little bit about models for storytelling that exist already, a little bit about creative futures, and a little bit about, again, monolithic thinking. So one of my favorite ways to approach this is that in the shock doctrine, Naomi Klein puts out an excellent idea about essentially the stories of capitalism. Uh, she says essentially that we are storytelling creatures, and that when we're confronted with stories that we can't process, right? Stories like climate change, which are large, sometimes overwhelming, we get thrown into what she calls a kind of narrative aporia, this sort of confusion where we cannot see a story, we cannot make sense. And that this narrative aporia, this not having a story with which to process the world, makes us vulnerable to the kinds of narratives that disaster capitalists put forward, essentially. Like, there's nothing you can do about the destruction of your home. Let us buy this land from you, etc. And so within that space, I think it's really useful for me to think about, well, how do we start chipping into this sort of monolithic story that capitalism is? Capitalism is a story that's really great at absorbing other stories. We have a hard time. There's a really famous quote that it's easier to envision the end of the world than it is to envision the end of capitalism. And I think that's why we write a lot of dystopias. But what else we might be able to put in that space is, I think, one of the primary challenges we're facing. And again, I think it's a fallacy to think that we have to fix it all at once. Sometimes I think it can be enough to recognize this mechanism and to name it and to think, okay, because we feel trapped in this monolithic story, because we don't know what that next step is, well, that's scary, but it also offers us a potential opportunity. We're probably going to feel uncomfortable as we try to figure out what these next stories are, but it's a space that we can absolutely explore. And so, yeah, thinking about this idea of, even if, as I'm saying this, you're feeling kind of bored with the idea of let's just sort of blanket blame capitalism and the historical movements that lead towards it for everything, all right, that's good. What can you do with that boredom, right? Is there a character there? Is there a voice there? Is there a storyline where you want to explore what that issue is? Because as we sort of try to put chips into these monolithic structures, we can start to find stories. Some models that we have for that are actually historical models. So when I'm talking about this idea that when we experience narrative aporia, we tend to run back to things that feel familiar, genres where we've talked about climate change before, right? So that's why we'll end up frequently creating sci-fi dystopias, because we know how to talk about climate change in terms of sci-fi dystopias. We know how to talk about climate change in terms of sort of the disaster movie, the event disaster movie, like what happens if it's the day after tomorrow and the glaciers are coming or the tsunami is coming. And that's a great place to start, but dystopias do tend to, again, reinforce the idea that capitalism is monolithic and it's going to essentially extract everything and leave us in a wasteland. So some writers are suggesting that spaces like comedy and spaces like mythology offer up different models for storytelling that we can try to pick up because they'll let us address some of these issues in different ways. Uh, Mythic structures often have multi-generational heft. They often want to talk about the world other than the human, right? There's personifications of animals inside of them, and they're frequently thinking about cycles of life. And so incorporating pieces like those can sometimes lend work that might otherwise feel uncertain, a kind of framing narrative that will help it. Certainly, even for myself, I've written a play where the Noah's Ark narrative and the deluge in the Noah's Ark narrative sort of cycles itself through the play and helps ground what's occurring in it. Comedy also, there's a German writer called Ursula Heiss who writes sort of literary analysis about climate change. And one of her sort of most interesting theories for me is that comedy itself is always a genre that's about equilibrium, right? It's about violating societal norms, and then learning to balance yourself again. And so coming into the space of comedy may mean we have a space to explore, again, not necessarily the towering climate villains, but maybe just the small, petty climate villains, like the people, your mother-in-law who won't stop going on cruises and how that is annoying you becomes a space in terms of thinking about how do we reconcile ourselves and find a way to come into balance in our societies, to come into balance with the natural world, that all of that might just be baked into how it is we address climate change. Another challenge is, and this I think speaks to the person who is grappling with earnestness, is that we really do want to try, I think, to write towards solutions in the sense that dystopian pieces tend to foreshadow the end of the world and all the suffering that accompanies it. I think a lot of us feel, like I could see it in our map as well, we're looking for these hopeful stories. But they feel challenging because we're existing in post-normal times. When I've given talks like this before, often one of the first things I'll talk about is this idea of we should stop thinking about the climate crisis as something that is in the future and start thinking about it now. I don't think that's really an issue anymore. I think we are in that headspace. But I think the next problem is, again, that we're butting up against that sort of narrative aporia and that story of capitalism that feels monolithic, that there's a lot of chaos and complexity around us, and it feels like we don't have viable paths forward. So thinking about how it is we model futures that don't feel too earnest, that don't feel too utopian, can be, again, a really useful space to come into this work, to think not necessarily about showing us a sort of a perfectly solved culture, but as we're moving into this writing, what do we think is going to persist as a problem, right? How can we show a climate future that we are surviving in, but that still contains the conflicts that we want for our narrative and still contains the conflicts that are interesting to us to explore? So I think here a lot about work like Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140, where New York has experienced sea level rise. Housing co-ops have become a big solution for that. I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil small parts of the novel for you, but that the desire to own real estate, the desire to have value is still an immense problem in that space. And so even though we're seeing a solutionary climate piece where we have gone more than 100 years into the future and we have all kinds of fascinating solutions, we still have the conflicts that are intrinsic to that kind of work. And so I think it's really worth thinking about as you're approaching your work. Climate futures don't really need to be utopias or dystopias. That's, again, kind of a fragment of that binary thinking that either we're going to fix it entirely or it's going to go terribly and we're all going to be, living in the world ruled by the mushrooms in The Last of Us. That instead, there are middle spaces, both for the present, where we can be modeling what does the present crisis look like and what might we be able to do with it? How might we be able to deal with our grief, et cetera, and for the future. And finally, this is one of those pieces that I think underscores a lot of climate thought. You have a lot of writers like Donna Haraway, who has a beautiful book called Staying with the Trouble, which wants to talk about the idea that we tend to think in binaries, and the binaries themselves tend to reinforce the power relationships that we're talking about. So if you have this idea, I'm sure you've heard the expression, what you resist persists. If you're just thinking about trying to shift power from one group to another, you aren't actually dismantling the power relationship. You aren't actually thinking about solutions. And so I think one of the things that can help us a lot as we move into trying to write about climate is thinking about what binaries are we trapped in? Like, are we thinking about man and nature as two separate categories? And can we destabilize that for ourselves? Are we thinking about, are we thinking about, sorry, I'm going to head back to my notes here. Are we thinking about capitalism and then communism as sort of two opposed pieces and not necessarily thinking about what might be happening on the fringes? Are we not leaving spaces for solutions that are already in play, like housing co-ops, like other kind of collective action. So thinking about those ideas, thinking about, for instance, can we move from thinking about our work, like capitalism and labor, as sort of these two poles versus sort of more community ingrained networks, networks that are based on care. All of those things are potential spaces to look for new climate writing. And what are we doing? Oh, I think we're right on time. Excellent. So I'm going to pull up the whiteboard map. And I think one of the things I'd like to, again, to invite us to do is if you've got pen and paper or you've got something to open up, I'd love for you to actually start just a free write. Just open up something and start working into what spaces are you feeling conflicted and uncertain about? Like, where are your actual climate questions here? I'm going to stop this share and get that whiteboard up. Existing whiteboards. There's our guy. So we have this space. And this is sort of where we were starting. But just get your pen moving and start asking yourself, like, where are your actual struggles and conflicts? What binaries might you be holding on to? Oh, yeah, and I'll pop up some of the references into the chat at the end of the as resources at the end of the talk. Have I just done that again? And especially for those of you thinking about comedy. Yeah. Oh, yes, the task. Thank you. For those of you thinking about comedy, it's always worth thinking about like what are your like, little rebellions or the ways that you follow your worst instincts. Because frequently you can find characters there. Like one of the things I find myself thinking a lot is about like when I look inward at myself, like what is my instinct to sort of like punish or police people who aren't performing like climate justice the way I think they should be performing climate justice. Because sometimes there's something that there might be something funny in that, there might be an arc in that. Sometimes it can be interesting to follow your sorrow, right? Like when you think about like these experiences, like being in the wildfires and having to evacuate, like there's something that's like yeah, just sort of profoundly sad in terms of loss. And what does that loss like what does it prompt you to think about? What does it prompt you to how does it cause you to relate to people? Move into the free write and try to find like where this is actually touching your life in terms of your psychology or in terms of what you're observing in other people. It can be great also to think particularly in terms of behaviors. Like I'll often observe myself like doom scrolling. We've all been guilty of doom scrolling. And I'll think about how much I feel seen when I see someone doing something like that. Like I think Poker Face had a great version of that happening with that character just sort of obsessively doom scrolling. And sometimes seeing climate stories, again, just a moment that that reality touches up against the world. I'm sure that's not 5 minutes, but I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to give you at least one more minute to keep working with it. But also, if there are things that are emerging from trying to move into that space that you want to pop up in the chat, please feel free to add anything that feels kind of revelatory for you in the chat. All right. Sorry, I'm going to pull down the whiteboard again. But oh, discovering new technology that solves real world problems. That's really exciting. Yes. And it always makes me think a little bit about where am I putting this? I'm going to share my screen up again. It always makes me think about McLuhan's fourth law, because I think we have real tendencies to, again, in that kind of utopian mode, think about, oh, this technology is going to solve something, and then have it become an excuse to use more or have unforeseen knock-on effects because technology tends to reverse back upon itself. But again, that space of the complexity and the idea that sometimes even that kind of dystopian thought about technology might blind us to technology that actually are helping, like green spaces, et cetera. No, there's fascinating pieces to write into there. All right. So this last section is one of the spaces where I'm going to talk about actual tools. So we've sort of talked about what our challenges are, what some of the philosophies we might bring into it are. These are sort of the more bread and butter pieces that we can take into our writing and think about how will I get this done. So within this space, we're going to talk a little bit about climate placement and a little bit about climate lenses, about climate psychology in particular, because that's really helpful for building characters, about strategies we can actually pick up from other art forms, and finally about just the need for practice. So often one of the places we'll start when we think about concretely moving climate into our work is with the idea of climate placement. And this is an idea that's coming in many ways from places like the Good Energy Playbook. There's a lot of resources online from sustainable, like basically from film groups that are looking to green what it is we do. And the Green Energy Playbook is an excellent one if that's a place you want to start. And often climate placement involves almost like a kind of product placement for the environment checklist. Like you're just looking kind of in the same way that I'll say we're looking for climate borders or we're looking for places where climate can make its way into a script. And you'll start looking for things like settings. Can climate just provide a backdrop for this space? Climate characters. So can characters carry climate messages with them? And you can think here about things like, for instance, for climate settings, that might be the entire series, right? When you have, something like Yellowstone, you might be able to tilt that towards a kind of climate placement by being more overt about the fact that those lands are experiencing probably quite a lot of topsoil erosion. If you want to, that's something that can just organically find its way into a script. You have people doing that with, like, I think I was just talking to Elsa about Grey's Anatomy setting a whole episode during the Seattle heat dome, right? The setting itself is just enforcing what that narrative is going to be in that moment. For climate characters, you might be looking at somebody like Dallas Goldtooth, who's actually carrying an activist space with them. You could look at something like Sam in Ted Lasso. There's an episode that emerges from his connection to his family because he's been turned into not a mascot, but like almost like a spokesperson for a company that is polluting in Nigeria, and he has to negotiate his relationship to that. It's worth thinking about as you build characters. How do you represent the diversity of the climate attitudes you see around you, because again, we're not monolithic. Some people are much more in the activist space. Some people would prefer to pretend that this is not happening. Some people are, doing this part, but not interested in doing this part. They're perfectly happy to do all the recycling, but they're never going to give up their car. All of those, that spectrum of behaviors is possible in terms of how you're generating characters. Uh, Climate placement will also frequently focus on climate behaviors. And this sometimes is a way to take pieces that don't necessarily have what we think of as much to do with climate, though, I mean, we're all on the planet. It's all having to do with climate, but creating a space in them where they're just in sort of that rom-com comedy mode, just modeling good behavior off the side of their desk, essentially. And this is spaces where you can think about, do we see characters just recycling without comment? Do we see characters who are just using, like, again, using the recyclable or reusable mugs? Do we see people who just happen to have solar generators? Is that just being normalized as a way to live, as potentially even an aspirational way to live? And climate placement tends to do all of those things. Once you get into things like climate lenses, you might be looking at more profound philosophical shifts in how it is we understand the world to operate. And that can move into sort of the voice of the piece more than perhaps the voice of the character. So you can think about things that want to look at things. Potential lenses are things like deep ecology being a space where we think about ourselves not as the most important creatures on the planet. And so if you look at something like extrapolations, and the way extrapolations is still talking about humans, but it's looking at humans in terms of generations of time, looking at different points and different, that you can think of that as having perhaps a kind of deep ecological lens to shift. You can also think about things that sometimes will offer us different viewpoints, right? Like Miranda Julie has a, sorry, July, I always say her name. Miranda July has a piece called The Future, which has a narrative frame that's actually coming from a cat, an elderly cat that's been abandoned, and that giving that perspective on the development of the humans in that space, it shifts us from, again, a mode of address that thinks of us as the most important people on the planet. And so there's interesting kind of ideas like that. Social ecology is a great place to think about where the intersectionality of the climate crisis can live, because social ecology is a lens that looks at like the domination of nature by the human as stemming from the domination of human by human. And so that sort of long chain of exploitation that leads us to both the political crisis we are currently experiencing and the climate crisis is sort of prefigured by a social ecology lens, which sees us as essentially having to give up hierarchy and domination if we intend to come into better relationships with both ourselves and our world. So climate psychology is a growing field, and this is really useful often for writers because a lot of our writing emerges from character and character psychology. It's admittedly an emerging field, but there's a host of new developments that are fascinating. And so you have people who are doing studies on climate grief and how climate grief manifests itself, climate anxiety, and the way we see it shaping up in young people. You have fascinating things like shifting baseline syndrome, which is our tendency to see ourselves as like whatever degree of nature we experienced when we were children, that's the degree of nature that we kind of think is normal and expect to continue throughout our lives. And so there's ways in which future generations might not even understand the depth of the climate crisis and the depth of what they have lost potentially because they never were there to witness it and it isn't their baseline. Catastrophic control is a really fascinating thing that happens. People frequently feel because of the kind of aporia and the way that they can't do anything about capitalism, that it's sort of better to throw up their hands. It's better sort of to dance merrily on the edge of the volcano. And if you've ever heard someone talk about a climate edgelord, that kind of character psychology can, again, be something that you are reflecting. And again, some of this may not feel like, oh, that's the most positive piece to dig into, but again, thinking about arcs and thinking about people coming to understand and recognizing the world they're being presented with, there's all sorts of fascinating spaces to dig into that climate psychology opens up for us. There's also lots of strategies that we can pick up from other art forms. Novels actually have a really long history of engaging with climate, frequently, again, as the backdrop of things that are happening, right? Like you think about like the floods in Middlemarch, you think about all the sort of transcendental writing that will frequently, like Moby Dick is talking about nature in sort of very sort of sublime and unknowable ways. But again, they give you these touch points to sort of move in and start pulling ideas forward. Visual arts can give us a lot of like fascinating visuals and other pieces to take up. The image here is actually from Jason DeCare's underwater sculptures. He builds coral reefs that are shaped like humans, but then become non-human as the coral itself begins to grow on them in sort of fascinating biological ways. And again, picking up pieces like that, or like there's a fellow in Scandinavia who builds these sort of strand beasts, which are these sort of ongoing driftwood monsters. There's all kinds of really interesting responses there that you can sort of like pull forward, especially for film where visuals are important. They can be really useful. Plays sometimes give us really interesting lenses because they concentrate a lot on metaphor. And so you have pieces, for instance, like Chantal Bilodeau writes a lot of pieces that have interesting, like, again, like lenses and modes of address. She has a piece called Forward that actually travels backwards through time along a glacier, where all the different people who are involved in first the scientists measuring the glacier all the way back to the sort of the Scandinavian discoverers who are sort of opening the space up are having these conversations about sustainability. There are writers who, again, because plays are more metaphorical, they'll be looking at having like polar bears speak or tuataras speak. And those storytelling lenses are things that we might be able to adopt. And finally, of course, there is the current boom of climate fiction. There's a lot of writing in the novel space and in also the graphic novel space that is taking up these ideas and again offering us both modes of address and also just like potential IP if there are people in the audience who are in a position to be like actually acquiring IP. So I've already talked about New York 2140, which is part of Kim Stanley Robinson's work. He's a great writer to follow if you're interested in this in terms of the novel space. We've had Kate Beaton's Ducks, which is about her working in the Alberta oil sands, and it's a really great way of showing like the personal in relationship to the environment. You have things like Animals People, which takes on the Bhopal disaster. What else do I have on my list here? Oh, and yeah, and of course there's Jeff Vandermeer, who you're seeing create a kind of climate science fiction in things like Annihilation and Born. And again, all of these are these sort of interesting developments that we can examine and look for strategies inside of in terms of how we want to shape our address. And finally, the last piece that I want to tackle is actually just this idea of the power of practice, because this is like a really short blitz that I'm doing right now of a number of ideas. But I think it's worth noting that even for me sometimes, because of what this is, climate writing will feel very uncomfortable. And because of that sort of, again, that weird polarization, that sense that it's a third rail, it can be easy to be discouraged from it. And I think I always like to say, well, we're going to get it wrong and we're going to feel uncomfortable. And in any other situation as writers, we're really, really used to that because that's our process. We have to do it sort of again and again and again. And so I think it's worth thinking about the idea of just go into it and and practice living with the discomfort, because the longer we can live with the discomfort, the more the likelihood is you're going to find the piece that you think, oh yes, this is the story. And I'm going to end actually with a little story of my own. Actually, it's probably like 8 years ago now. I had gone to a playwriting retreat and it was in Umbria, and the summer was unfathomably hot. We were in like a little monastery, and there were olive trees all around. And in the evenings and in the mornings, they were having to come out with water to try to like to keep the heat from killing the olive trees. And I was struggling with like the sort of the poetic beauty of that and this sort of beautiful place that we were getting to exist in versus like this sort of looming specter of death. And Brandon Jacob Jenkins, who was running the piece, was just like, the interesting thing, right? The thing that you're struggling with right now, how to reconcile this beauty and this death, that that goes into the play, right? And almost always I find that is the best advice. Like the thing that you are grappling with, that naughty problem at the top of your mind, that's the best way in. And so I think I'm going to again just invite you to go in there and be uncomfortable and as much as possible give the problem to the play or the script, or the screenplay, as the case may be. So with that said, we're hitting the space where we're going to move into our breakout rooms. And this might be a point where I just check with Lisa. Okay, yeah, maybe we only really want to open two of them. Maybe we want to open one for discussion and one for craft. And I'm going to check in with Lisa about that.
So you would like me to just have two rooms?
I think
Craft and
so because
discussion.
it looks like we've got about the right number to do two. So we'll do one for craft and we'll do one for discussion. The way things are set up, you should be able to move between both. And what I'm sort of inviting you to do is in the craft room, like this, that's a space for us. Bring your problems and we'll actually just talk about what you might be able to do with those pieces. I'm going to head into the craft room and Elsa's going to head into the discussion room. And so I mean, we can practice pitching skills as well, thinking about like, can we find spaces for climate events in stories? Can we find climate characters or climate episodes? But we can also work with people's particular pieces. In the discussion room, I think what we had in the discussion space was this idea of like, how are you pitching climate to producers might be something that you wanted to talk about. You might still be feeling blocked. That might be something you want to talk about. But I think, again, because we're a smaller group, let's head into those rooms. Do you want to talk craft? Do you want to discuss larger issues? Whichever one you want to do, let's let the space of the room sort of decide itself. So with that said, oh, and just a little bit of housekeeping for it. Oh, I've gone too far. Sorry. So a little bit of housekeeping here. You're free to move around between the rooms. You'll be able to do that. Like I said, I'm probably going to be mostly in the craft room. Elsa's probably going to be mostly in the discussion room, but you can go back and forth. You can always pop out to the main room here where Lisa can help you if anything comes up. And once we've either exhausted our possibilities for discussion or time runs out, we'll all be popped back here into the main room for the wrap up. So with that said, Lisa, how are you doing?
I have two rooms, one called craft, one called discussion. I'm going to open them both now, and I will allow everyone here to choose where they want to go.
Brilliant. We will
So
see you
have
in the
fun.
discussion rooms or the craft room. Thank you. Excellent. And we are back. Uh, so just in this next little space, I got to talk to some folks in the craft room, which was lovely. And I didn't get to hear so much of what was going on in the discussion room. So if there is anything that folks feel like sharing, I think this might be a moment to head to the gallery view. What's come up in your discussions that feels like something you might want to talk about? Oh, oh, you
Can I
folks are
just finish the last thing I was saying? Because I was the one that was cut off. It was an idea that the public broadcasters should no longer commission shows that have cars in them. That would just be my dream. Think of a future without cars. How are you going to get around? No more cars. So.
That's interesting. We were talking in the craft room a little bit about Teslas and how Teslas had become this sort of signifier of environmental purity. And now, of course, that's kind of collapsed in on itself.
Uh-huh.
And you're watching all these people scramble to like make their Tesla better. But then underneath that, there's also the thing like Teslas are
There's no more
incredibly
cars. It's just another
expensive.
car.
Exactly.
Electric cars are just here to save the auto industry. It's not about the environment.
Oh, excellent. Were there other things that came up in the discussion that felt uh like you want to share them or other questions?
There was something I was thinking that because we were talking about how nobody wants to greenlight climate stories, and I read a book recently about the climate crisis, about how they think that all media is going to have like a meta commentary of climate because it's going to be such a big part of the life we live that you can't tell a story without it because it's going to just be the water we swim in, you know? So I don't know if it's necessarily like if it's worth losing hope about the fact that they don't want to greenlight stories about it, because pretty soon that's the only stories there'll
Well,
be.
and I would actually go one stage further and say that if we don't have it in, we're going to date our shows. Like
Yeah.
in 5 years, parents won't want kids watching a show with cars in it because it will
Oh,
look so out of touch and so clueless, like the Tesla issue.
But
Yeah.
we also don't know how the world is going to change due to climate. Like it's hard to write for the future.
We have
You
to
can
write a
write
better
for
future,
time.
I think.
Yeah, you
Well,
hope.
and I think it can also be valuable to think about we are, as we always are, writing for now,
Hmm.
right? Like right now is a lot of the anxiety, and right now is a lot of the grief. And I think to Madeline's point, I think yes, we are seeing like the tides starting to turn in terms of people are starting to recognize more and more that people want to hear about this. You have studies like the one that Alice is doing, but you can also see like the and I think it's the NRDC. I never get the acronym right, but the Blacklist has a huge, like, it has a $20,000 climate writing fellowship that happens annually now. It's been happening for years, and you're seeing movements like the Hollywood Climate Summit and the Sustainable Production Forum moving more and more into this. So I think there's a sense of an awareness of, yeah, we are starting to understand that we haven't been doing our job in terms of narrativizing this, and it's time to get working.
Okay, I also had a question. Like, obviously, Donald Trump right now is trying to get rid of mentions of climate change all over the internet. And how do you think this is a good way for us to combat that as storytellers? Like, if he's removing actual information, how are we, you know what I'm saying? I feel like it's our job now at this point.
Yeah. I mean, it's not our job alone. I think that's one of those things to always think about a little bit is like there's people who are doing that. Like I'm watching people as they did in fact when Stephen Harper removed a bunch of our own environmental data about 10 years ago, right? I'm watching people try to archive it. People are trying to do that work. And I think again, one of our jobs is to hold up a mirror to say, "Hey, this is what this looks like. How are we doing?"
Mhm.
Right? And again, you might not be able to write for exactly this moment, but certainly everybody who's writing right now about like the problems of fascism and the frailty of our sort of democratic, they're writing that from impetus that's been happening since 2016. So I
Mhm.
think when I think about that, I think about what is the thing that you see in particular that you would like to change? And maybe
Mhm.
it's big or maybe it's small. And then go into it, right? The rest of it you can't control.
Yeah.
But you can absolutely try to like get whatever that piece is, whether it's we had a really great talk about a piece about birding, whether it's about like recognizing sort of the beauty of this space around you, whether it's doing something like extrapolations, which is again trying to show us like the trajectory doesn't feel like this here, but here's what it feels like once we get here. And that's a really valuable piece. So I think one of the things that at least empowers me to do this work is like I don't have to nail it. I don't have to defeat fascism. I just
yeah.
have to tell as much of the story, as much of the world as I can. And eventually, if we're all doing it,
Yeah.
yeah,
Then it
we go
changes
forward.
the overall
But
narrative
do
of
you want to
everything.
write stories that inspire people? I think, and it's not just making them aware, but making them realize that they can contribute to change the world. I
That's something
mean,
we were talking about in the discussion room, right? Like the nihilism of it is the fascism winning.
yes, yes. So we need to defeat that. And as artists, we have a responsibility to, as she said, hold the mirror up, but to also give people the ability to realize things can get better and we can change things.
But
Because
isn't it also, oh, sorry, isn't it also
no,
important to show the consequences of if you don't do anything? Like sometimes I see climate optimistic stuff, and I'm like, cool, that's a beautiful future, but how do you intend to get there? You know what I'm
well,
saying?
but
And
she
there's a
also,
couple of different, sorry, I just because
I
I'm
want
again
to just say
cognizant of
what
time.
Jordan said something that's really important, that children now they don't realize what clean air was because they weren't alive 20 years ago and they didn't breathe it. So I
Mhm.
think that's really an important issue to bring up in the stories because I remember getting off airplanes and breathing clean air. And you don't hardly, and now I look at an app every day to see how clean the air is. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
scary.
the fires themselves are a metaphor that's going to live with me for a very, like, probably maybe with us for the rest of our lives. But I think there was something in there I wanted to talk about both there's historical precedents. We have a real tendency as humans to feel like we're really good at responding immediately to problems, which has been really bad for our response to climate change up to now, and is now going to play in our favor because the problem's here. But
Yeah.
also, we have a really hard time remembering what was like. Try to remember actually tangibly what your life was like before the pandemic,
Hard.
right? Your brain has already. So one of the things we can do is pull up that kind of collective memory. So thinking about things like FDR made a bunch of parks in the middle of the Depression because these things, like, it feels monolithic, but it's not. And I don't necessarily know how to tell exactly that story yet, but I know that, like, and that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of bringing up a lot of the resources of people who are like, let's name it. There's an aporia. We don't know how to tell the story. So fine, let's try this. Let's try this. Let's pull up comedy. Let's pull up mythology. It is about sort of like leaning into the work. But yeah, those past models of we rallied and the ozone layer did get fixed. We had someone who was leading, who we elected, who actually, yeah, leaded glass. Thank you very much. Like we have done this before, and the idea that we can't, or the idea that fascism might be like, that's what I'm sure Donald Trump would like to think of it as monolithic,
Yeah.
but is it? And looking for the ways in which, and we're watching people, we're observing like little rebellions and big rebellions all the time. And that's the job, is to find those stories. And yeah, I don't have a perfect answer for you. I only have the work.
Cool.
Well, thank you for the, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the word
Yeah.
aporia, which for some reason I have not encountered, but it sums up this entire conversation extremely well, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, well, what you might love, and I will actually, I'm going to quickly share up my screen just for like the very last little bit of this, because I've got a few resources to
Oh,
hand
good.
off to you, and we may have to follow up with some links.
Mhm.
But here's that, and here's that. But we've got Elsa's resources at the CBC, so definitely make use of Elsa. She is amazing. She is doing all kinds of studies about what it is folks want. It's definitely, you can go to the Good Energy Playbook, which I have that link. I may
I
have a
went
hard
to
time
the
getting.
Hollywood Climate Summit last year.
Oh,
yeah.
amazing.
Wasn't as good as I hoped, but mind you, I
Mm.
probably had expectations that were beyond
I can
realistic.
hear your desire to end cars, not necessarily going over super well. But again, everybody's on their
In
own
ballet.
part
Yeah.
of this journey. But yeah, the Good Energy Playbook is really useful. Sometimes just because they have these huge lists that you can look into and just think, oh, I could try that. I could try that. There's all sorts of things here. Here in Canada, we have the Sustainable Production Forum. They're a great place to meet other people who are interested in this. We have the Hollywood Climate Summit. I definitely look into the NRDC Fellowship, because if you're doing this work, you should be applying for it. Some books to start off with for the gentleman who liked Aporia. Amitav Ghosh has a piece called The Great Derangement, which is,
I've read them all, yeah.
well, then you're
I
ahead of
also
it.
want to read The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells.
That
Oh,
is a
excellent.
terrifying book. That book
Yeah,
is so
that's
fucking
kind of
scary.
right now the lodestone book of the climate thing.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Catherine Hayhoe is good to read too.
Mhm.
I like Braiding Sweetgrass. That one's positive.
Yes.
You want to talk about positive climate
Excellent.
stuff.
Cool.
All of those are wonderful. This last one, Imagining Extinction, is for the person who was asking about Ursula Heiss. Her book, Imagining Extinction, is a really excellent overview of, in a lot of ways, literary art around climate change. And she investigates lots of different models for trying to tell those stories, things like lists and the way mythoses work, the way comedies work. And then this last one, How to Do Nothing, is, I will say Jennifer's name wrong, but it's a lovely piece that, in particular, the person who's working with the birder might be interested in, because she actually, oh my gosh, it's Jenny Odell, became a birder in the course of the pandemic, and it was part of her move away from the attention economy to a more contemplative economy. So you might really like that. And then finally, I am available through the Hollier Agency if you want to chat or for anything else. I'm always happy. I'm sometimes very busy, but I'm always happy to chat with people about their work in this
Sorry,
space.
what agency? What?
Hollier, Jennifer Hollier. Yeah. So you can just
AHA.
give them a quick, and like I think we're gonna give you, maybe we're gonna make up a little email post that will have a lot of these things in it, including my contact and
Dude,
where you can contact Elsa as well.
You're
please
gonna
do.
With that, I want to say thank you so much. We're a little tiny bit late, but thank you so much to both Elsa and Lisa for making this space. Thank you folks so much for attending. And yeah, you are now released into the wild. Go have an evening.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank
Bye now.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.